Oh look, more questions for atheists. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Dr. Michael Brown's website to see what he wants to know, even though we know he's not really talking to us. They never are, after all. He's just making up stories for the good of his followers so they keep handing over their hard-earned cash. But what else is new, right? As you know, I tend to like answering the questions of the religious, even though they're not really intended for us. Heck, I'm happy to do this for anybody if the questions are interesting enough. Anybody who wants me to answer some non-religious questions, hit me up in the comments and I'll take a look. So, what does Dr. Brown want to know? Well, let's dive into it and find out. So, before we actually get to the questions, I wanted to say a couple of things. A while back, while I was talking about apologists, a couple of you asked that I do more on Dr. Michael Brown. So, I went looking for anything on his YouTube channel that looked interesting, and I came up empty. His YouTube channel, the few things that I looked at, they just didn't work out. They were either too long, or a lot of it he was just making excuses for things, nothing that really struck me as being very intriguing. Then I came across this thing. He's asking some questions to atheists over on his website, and I figured this was a pretty good place to start. We like answering questions around here, right? So here we go with 7 questions from Dr. Michael Brown that will not go well for him. If you come across any specific videos on his YouTube channel that you want me to take a look at, post the links in the comments below. So, let's get started. Is your atheism based on study or experience? First, would you say that you are or were an atheist based primarily on intellectual study or based on experience? Or did you never believe in God at all? Well, for me, it has to be 100% based on intellectual study. I can't even imagine how you'd go about experiencing atheism. What does that even mean? You have to consider that I became an atheist while trying to demonstrate that the Bible was true. I believed it wholeheartedly and believed that truth had nothing at all to fear from investigation. That's just not how things worked out in the real world. The simple fact is, the fastest way to prove the Bible wrong is to actually test the Bible and look for evidence. Try to find objective corroboration that it's actually true. Look for evidence that the claims of the Bible actually happened as described, because that's a fast track out of Christianity right there. Just caring about the truth proves every bit of the supernatural nonsense false. And that's why Christians are loath to do it, because they're absolutely terrified of the real world. Put another way, was it the lack of answers to prayer or failures within organized religion or some other anti-faith experience that first caused you to question the existence of God? Or was it something you learned in school or your studies that caused you to doubt? Or were you raised without belief in God and you've never found a good reason to question it? Nope, I already answered that. And I think it's funny, if you read this, he's not talking to us. He's talking to Christians. Now, he's talking to Christians who supposedly used to be atheists, but he's not talking to current atheists, because they never want to do that, because that's just childish. What he's really asking here is, why did the church hurt you? Show me on the doll where the priest touched you. Why are you mad at God? The problem is, though, I'm not. This is a purely intellectual exercise. Nothing ever happened. I can remember absolutely nothing but positive experiences with the church and with the clergy. I just wasn't convinced that any of the teachings were true anymore. Truth matters a lot more than comfort does. And that's something that the religious and I just don't have in common. Do you have purpose and destiny? Second, would you say that even as an atheist, you still have a sense of purpose and destiny in your life, a feeling that you were put here for a reason and that you have a mission to accomplish? Or is it primarily people of faith who feel this, since we are simply the products of an unguided, random evolutionary process? Nope, and neither do you. Oh, I get that you want those things, but they simply aren't demonstrable. What you wish for doesn't make it so. I wasn't put here for anything, and neither were you. I wasn't put here at all. I just kind of popped out and that was it. The same thing happens with the religious. They just don't like the idea. This is an emotional problem, not an intellectual one. They want to live in a different world than the one they actually live in. That's why they just invent nonsensical beliefs and absurd assertions, because they've got a goal in mind that isn't just coming to grips with reality. Any purpose that you have in life, you have to come up with yourself. Nobody gets to assign it to you. Some magic man in the sky didn't send you here to do his bidding. That's just stupid. What matters is the evidence, and sadly, the religious just don't have any. Does God exist? Third, would you say that you are 100% sure that there's no such thing as God, meaning an eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing being? Or would you say that, for all practical purposes, you have concluded that this God does not exist, although it is impossible to prove such a negative with absolute certainty? Well, let's clarify a few things here. There's no such thing as absolute certainty for anything. If you claim that there is, you've got some mental problems. Based on every shred of evidence that we have, and note, that's not your emotional interpretation of the evidence, but the actual evidence itself, there is no rational reason to think that any gods of any kind actually exist in reality. That's not to say that none definitely do, because we don't know anything to any degree of absolute certainty. But we can only gauge our positions based on the evidence that we actually have at hand. And that doesn't mean that you just get to declare, "Therefore God," every time you run into something without a clear and emotionally comforting explanation. Because that's not how evidence works. You have to have something that clearly and verifiably points to your specific deity actually existing in the real world that we all share. You got any of that? Yeah, I didn't think so. Can science explain the origins of life? Fourth, do you believe that science can provide answers for many of the remaining mysteries of the universe, including how the universe began, including where matter came from and where the Big Bang derived its energy, the origins of life, and DNA coding? Well, yeah, it can. Now, we don't have all the answers today, and granted, we may never have the answers. That's something that scares the crap out of the religious, because they want all the answers right now on a silver platter, and that's not how reality works. But potentially speaking, yes, science can do that. Maybe. We may not live to see it, but maybe it'll get there at some point in time. And if it doesn't, that doesn't mean you get to go, "Therefore God." Again, this is the difference between the rational and the religious. They want certain things to be true. They're running on pure fifis and faith. They want to feel special, but that doesn't mean that they are. The fact is, we haven't found anything that science can't explain yet. There are things that science hasn't explained yet, but there's nothing that we found that science inherently can't address. Never once has the answer to any question ever demonstrably been God. And that's pretty telling if you ask me. Again, these questions are not intended to stump you or prove that science can't answer everything. Instead, I'm genuinely wondering if you feel comfortable saying we may not be able to answer all these questions now, but over time we'll get the answers, and we won't need God to fill the gaps. I love how a lot of theists are careful to say that these aren't meant for nefarious purposes. It's like the con man saying, well, I'm not trying to rip you off, while they're picking your pocket. But anyhow, yes, I am comfortable saying that it is likely that we will come up with answers to most questions given enough time and enough study. Even if we don't, though, I don't really care, because not understanding something isn't a license to just make stuff up because you really wish that you knew. That's not how reality works. Science is the only methodology to which we currently have access that has the long record of success that it does. Religion, on the other hand, has absolutely no demonstrable record of success. It has done nothing but fail. It's all about making up emotionally comforting answers because they desperately want it to be true. But that doesn't mean that it is. Have you questioned your atheism? Fifth, have you had any experiences in life that caused you to question your atheism? Has something happened to you that seemed genuinely supernatural or otherworldly? Or have you been confronted with some information that shook your atheistic foundations, such as a scientific argument for intelligent design? If so, how have you dealt with such doubts about your atheism? Now, I find this to be an interesting question because it's really nonsense when you think about it. It's just more evidence that Brown hasn't got a clue what the hell he's doing. What does that even mean? It's like asking if you've engaged in not collecting stamps. What is there to do? I am not convinced that there are any gods. It's not an activity or a positive belief to which you can take exception. Now, do I constantly search for the truth, no matter what it is? Yes, absolutely I do. Has that brought me any closer to a belief in any gods? No, quite the opposite, in fact. The more that I research religious claims, the worse they perform in the real world. The evidence for any god keeps getting worse and worse, no matter what it is. It's never getting any better. They're never getting any closer to the truth. The question of whether or not I question my atheism is malformed at best and nonsensical at worst. Do I question everything? Absolutely I do. And it's too bad that people like Brown never question their faith, because if they did, Jesus, they couldn't continue to hold this crap. Are you materialistic? Sixth, are you completely materialistic in your mindset? Meaning human beings are entirely physical, human consciousness is an illusion, and there is no spiritual realm of any kind. Or are you superstitious, reading horoscopes, or engaging in New Age practices or the like? Well, that's what we have evidence for, like it or not. Ultimately, everything comes down to the evidence. What can we demonstrate is most likely to be so without relying on your fifis or faith. The religious, they're not interested in reality, they just want to have their fifis coddled, which is absolutely childish. And again, this question is completely malformed, especially the part about human consciousness being imaginary. It's not imaginary, it's just biological. It is a product of the physical human brain. That's it. But they don't like that, do they? Because here's the reality. We accept things for which there exists demonstrable evidence. Your feelings don't matter. The religious love to claim that there's a supernatural something out there somewhere. Okay, prove it. Explain what the hell the supernatural actually is. Don't tell me what it isn't. Tell me what it is. What is it made of, and how have you made that determination rationally? The problem here is that the religious can't do that, because they have absolutely nothing to present. They just want it to be true. The reason that we rely on methodological naturalism is because that's the only thing we've ever found any evidence for whatsoever. If you don't have evidence, then you don't have anything. Come on back when you've got evidence, because until then, you're just making a complete fool of yourself. Would you be willing to follow God? Seventh, if you were convinced that God truly existed, meaning the God of the Bible, who is perfect in every way, full of justice and mercy, our Creator and our Redeemer, would that be good news or bad news? Would you be willing to follow him and honor him if he were truly God? And the answer to that is more complex than the religious want to consider. Now, would I believe in a God like that? Would I believe in a God that was objectively demonstrable? Yes, sure, I would absolutely do that because I'd have the evidence for it. Would I bow down and kiss its ass? Well, that's another question entirely, and the religious can't really see the difference between the two. Now, this gets asked a lot, in fact. It's often the very last question on these lists for things that atheists are supposed to answer, and my answer is always the same. The God of the Bible, which is the one that he specified, is a complete and total dick. Absolutely nobody ought to be willing to follow such a ridiculous moral monster. Have you ever read the Bible? And the problem here is that the religious, they believe out of fear, not intellect. They are terrified that the God in the Bible, other gods too, but we'll stick with the one that Brown specified, if it was real, that it could squash them like a bug if they didn't kiss its ass. Therefore, that's exactly what they do to keep from being tortured for all eternity. And that's stupid. It really is. The only reason I would bow down to anything, and that's quite an ask as it is if it actually deserved my reverence. It would have to earn it, and the moral monster in the Bible absolutely doesn't. Like I said, if I was convinced that such a being existed at all, I would accept it as factual truth. Then I would go out and try to find the magic ring or sword, whatever it took, to kill the fucker. Believing out of fear is childish. Grow the hell up! I understand that no two atheists are identical, any more than any two believers are identical, and that everyone has their own unique story. I also understand that some of you who are believers today, were once atheists, and that others who were once believers are atheists today. And wasn't this question for atheists? Not for people who were formerly atheists, but for actual atheists? Yeah, I mean, that's what the title is, isn't it? So why is he talking to Christians? And the answer, of course, is that none of this is actually for atheists at all. It never really is. It's just a means for those who already believe to invent stories in their heads about what they imagine atheists might say. Because none of this is about atheism. None of these questions ever are. It's about coddling the fifis of the faithful and trying to make even more money. Because these people are dumb. In fact, they're so dumb that they can't even figure out just how dumb that they are, or the fact that we can see right through it all. I mean, what the hell is wrong with these people anyhow? Because that's really what this is all about. Brown isn't any different than Frank Turek or William Lane Craig or any of the other religious loons. He's not as erudite, perhaps, but he's really saying the same thing that they are and getting absolutely everything wrong, just like they do. See, here's the problem with the religious, one of many, 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 many problems. They don't actually care if any of their beliefs are demonstrable in the real world. It makes them happy, and therefore, in their heads, it just has to be so. How they know that and how they've tested it, well, they don't know because they don't even try. It just strikes an emotionally comforting chord, and therefore they just believe it blindly. Then they assume that everybody else is just like they are, driven by fear and wishful thinking, desiring nothing more than comfort and a constant drip of dopamine. Because that's religion for you. There are other guilty parties out there too, and they're all equally as wrong. The problem is none of them can see what it is that they're failing at because they just don't care. People like Brown are off trying to make a buck from the gullible, and the gullible are just there filling the pews, virtual or real, because they're only in it for the contentment because they can't handle the real world without it. It's all a bunch of sad, stupid people and those who take advantage of them, and that pretty much describes Dr. Michael Brown. That's what religion is, after all. The fact that these idiots can't figure out how to deal with the actual facts, that's sadder still. So, there you go. There are my answers to your questions, Dr. Brown. I trust you won't care what I or anybody else has to say, because this isn't about atheism at all. It's about conning the rubes. We all know what he's up to. It's just sad that the idiots following him around can't figure that out.